Greetings. Welcome to the final lecture in SHI's lecture series on Alaska Native subsistence, entitled Conservation Refugees, the 100-Year Conflict Between Global Conservation and Native Peoples, by Professor Mark Dowie. I'm Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department at SHI. We invite you to post questions in the chat box in YouTube as you watch the lecture, to which Professor Dowie has graciously responded to. He will respond at the end of his presentation. Professor Mark Dowie recently retired from the University of California Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley, where he taught science, environmental reporting, and foreign correspondence. Previously, he was editor-at-large of Internation, a transnational feature syndicate based in Paris, and before that, a publisher and editor of Mother Jones magazine. During his 35 years in journalism, Professor Dowie has written over 200 investigative reports for magazines, newspapers, and other publications. And besides Mother Jones, he either worked or wrote regularly for the Cleveland Press, the San Francisco Examiner, California Magazine, and American Health. He is a contributing editor of Orion and editor-at-large of Guernica magazines. His works have won 19 journalism awards, and in 1995, he was awarded a Doctor of Humane Letters by the John F. Kennedy University. His books include a critical history of the American environmental movement entitled Losing Ground, American Environmentalism at the Close of the 20th Century, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. American Foundations and Investigative History, and Conservation Refugees, the 100-Year Conflict Between Global Conservation and Native Peoples. And not to forget, the Haida Gwaii Lesson, a more recent work. Professor Dowie.
Well, thank you, Chuck. As Chuck implied, and as the title of one of my books suggests, I now introduce myself as an investigative historian. And I should explain quickly what that means, because it's not a common term. I worked for years as an investigative reporter. I developed investigative skills. And at the latter part of my working career, I started to notice that my material was turning up in history books. First of all, as footnotes, and then eventually as larger passages and references. And I became really, really interested in the role that media plays in creating history, because historians tend to go to the morgue of a newspaper whenever they begin their work in a community or wherever. So, and then I started reading histories that of things like conservation and native rights and that sort of thing. And I realized that they were missing some points, and they were missing the points because they weren't using investigative skills. They were just doing traditional historical research. Nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't go deep enough, and it often misses some very important points. So I started applying investigative skills to historical research, and then started calling myself an investigative historian. This book, which I'm going to talk about today, Conservation Refugees, is an investigative history. I went back and investigated the history of the relationship between transnational conservation and the indigenous rights movement that was taking place at the same time throughout the 20th century. And that's this story. Almost all of the stories that I did as a reporter were good guy versus bad guy stories. The black hats and the white hats were always obvious in everything I did until now. This book, this story, is a good guy versus good guy story. Transnational conservation and indigenous people both have a shared goal, and that's basically biological diversity. The goal has a different impulse. I think that conservationists see it as just ecological health, biota, a healthy biota, whereas indigenous people would attach to that food security. But the basic fact is they have a shared goal, and they care deeply about the health of the biota, the health of our global ecosystems. But they're at odds about it. And they're at odds about it, and have been at odds about it since the beginning of the 20th century, basically because of conflicting views of nature, conflicting definitions of wilderness, the word, and wilderness itself, and conflicting views about science and culture, and how science works, and how important cultural diversity is to the science of biological diversity. So there's been an ongoing conflict between conservation and Native people from the very beginning. As I say in the book, it's a senseless conflict. It never needed to happen. And fortunately, I can tell you now, this book came out in 2009. In the 10 years since, things have improved immensely in the relationship between global conservation and Native people. It's not where it should be yet, but it's getting better. So back at the beginning of the 20th century, the conservation movement of the world started creating what they call protected areas. And there are now 7 categories of protected areas. There may be more, but last time I looked, there were 7. They include national parks, they include wilderness areas, they include conservation projects, marine protected areas, etc. So there's 7 of them. And between the 1900 and 1950, there were a few hundred, maybe 600 protected areas created. There are now 120,000 protected areas on the planet. They cover a landmass larger than the entire continent of Africa. Now that sounds on the surface like a real accomplishment on the part of global conservation, that a landmass, a surface area on the planet the size of Africa, is now considered to be protected from a conservation, environmental, and ecological standpoint. The problem is that there's been a lot of human damage as a consequence of creating those protected areas, because many of those areas were occupied by human beings. And many of the early conservationists, and a few of the ones that are still surviving today, believed that the best way to protect those areas was to get human beings out of them. No matter who the human beings were, they had to get out. So this goes back to the definition of wilderness, and a distorted sense of what wilderness is and what wildness is, and whether or not leaving land wild is the best way to protect its biological diversity. That's still being argued about both by conservation wildlife biologists and by Native people. There's also a conflict here between 2 very august sciences, anthropology and wildlife biology. Anthropology is the study of human cultures, the study of human behavior and human nature, and wildlife biology is just what it suggests. It's basically ecology. It's wildlife ecology, and unfortunately, they have been a conflict about the value and the common sense of creating protected areas, as defined by the global conservation movement of the 20th century. So that's another conflict that is built into this conflict between global conservation and Native people. There's another conflict which I think is important to the story, and that is the conflict between traditional ecological knowledge, known in anthropological circles as TEK, select traditional ecological knowledge and wildlife biology, the Western science that drives global conservation, the Western science that textbook science that is taught in American and European universities, that is basically under the rubric of ecology and the rubric of creating healthy ecosystems. I was always amused by that conflict because as I started to travel the world researching this book and interviewing and talking with and conversing with Native people who would and asking about their traditional ecological knowledge, it sounded exactly to me like wildlife biology 101 that is being taught at the university where I taught, and that there was no reason or no for them to disagree with each other. TEK is there are no textbooks. It's handed down verbally from generation to generation, and wildlife biologists who spend time, and not enough of them do, meeting with and talking with the practitioners of traditional ecological knowledge, the wisdom keepers, the system keepers, the land keepers, the wildlife keepers in Indigenous, realize that they're basically saying the same thing. They're looking at the same thing. They're looking at the same systems. They're looking at the same ecological knowledge. It's just under a different name, TEK and wildlife biology. It's the same thing. And I think that what you're seeing now, fortunately, is a melding of these two august sciences, traditional ecological knowledge and wildlife biology, and creating what one native said to me. I forgot where it was somewhere in South America. He said, it's creating a new science. And the new science is strong, like two people. So they're melding two sciences, and he says now it's a stronger science. It's strong like two people. I never forgot that phrase. So while this is all going on, conservation, like so many industries and movements around the world, conservation is concentrating itself into fewer and fewer, larger and larger organizations that are becoming more and more global, and more active and more dominant in terms of how they are managing conservation around the world. There are now 5 very, very large conservation organizations that are all headquartered in Washington, D.C., that are basically dominating the transnational conservation agenda. Native people affectionately call them, although not always affectionately, but they affectionately call them the bingos. Bingo is an acronym that stands for Big International NGOs. So the bingos, which are, and you're familiar with all of them, I'm sure. Many of you may support them, one or more. Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, the African Wildlife Federation, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. Those are the big 5 bingos that are basically still dominating the conservation agenda of the world. And it's been their initiative that have caused historically, so many of the evictions of Native people from their land in the interest of conservation. Now, the numbers of people that have been displaced in the interest of conservation is widely debated number. Here's the number I use. During the 20th century, 20 million people worldwide were evicted from their land, forcibly removed in the interest of conservation. About 14 million of those were in Africa. The worst displacements promoted by and enforced by big conservation have been in Africa. But it's been happening all over the world. I think Antarctica is the only continent where forcible eviction of native people in the interest of conservation has not happened. So it's people jumped on me when I said 20 million, but it's pretty well documented, particularly the 14 million in Africa. But some of the numbers from elsewhere around the world are not quite as solid as the African numbers, but they add up to another 6 million. I'm pretty convinced of it. So 20 million in the 20th century. That's a lot of people that lost their livelihood, that lost their homelands. And these are homelands that had been occupied for thousands of years. Chuck mentioned Haida Gwaii, which is my most recent book. They've occupied their land for 13,000 years, 13,000. And most of these indigenous communities go back thousands and thousands of years. So they all of a sudden are shoved off their land. They usually they don't have anywhere to go, so they usually camp pretty close to the border of what was their original homeland. And because they're accustomed to hunting, fishing, and foraging in their homeland, they go back in. They poach. That's the word that their opponents use. They're poaching in a protected area, and now some of the bingos are paying armed guards to go in and shoot poachers. Who are really people who are just going back into their traditional homelands and hunting for protein and fruit and other things that they've been hunting there for thousands of years. Now, the irony to me of this whole movement is that when conservation started to find these areas of the planet that they said and decided needed protection and wanted to declare as a protected area, it was land that was occupied by people who understood the biology, understood the ecology, and really wanted it to be culturally diverse because that was good for food security. And so it was because there had been good stewards on this land that the land was healthy and was appealing to conservationists as potential land for protection. So what do? They kick the people out who have been protecting the land, who've been preserving the biological diversity for their own purposes, mostly food security, but they've been doing it. They kicked them out. It didn't make any sense at all, particularly when those very same people come back in and start poaching the wildlife for protein, an essential part of most diets. So that's part of the irony. And I think now that leaders of the conservation movement are starting to see that conflict, that irony, more clearly than they did when I was writing the book. And things are improving. And I'll get back to the improvements that are occurring in a moment. I want to just talk for a minute about the international movement of indigenous people, which have been a big part of their struggle. They've been struggling against the extractive industries for 100 years, and the corporations that have gone in and drilled their land, mined their land, run cattle on their land, and basically abused their ecosystems. Those are the traditional enemies of indigenous people, but only recently have they added conservation to their enemies list. In fact, some regard conservation as their biggest enemy now as a consequence. And while this was all going on, indigenous people have formed this, what I consider to be one of the most amazing social movements in the history of the world. What's amazing about it is that the indigenous world is 4,500 separate communities, all speaking separate languages, many of whom have never met each other, many of whom are not even aware of each other's existence, who over this period of time have managed to put together a global movement that has resulted in the United Nations passing a declaration for the rights of Indigenous people, and meeting, and they have gone to now to IUCN meetings and many conservation and national park meetings around the world, and to plead their case that this doesn't make sense. This kicking us off the land in the interest of conservation doesn't make sense. And what's amazing about it is that these are poor communities, but they're able to somehow get plane tickets and get to these conferences. They don't speak very many European languages, or languages that are used at these conferences, but they're there anyway. And enough of them do now speak the languages that they've been able to get their message across to global conservation and the big organizations behind it. It's to me, I think it's one of the most amazing social movements in history. The book is really about the 20th century, and we're now 20 years into the 21st century, and things are beginning to improve, beginning to change, not because of this book, but because Native people have been able to get their message into not only the bingos and global conservation, but into their funders. And the funders tend to, of the bingos, tend to pay attention to what's going on in the world besides what's just going on inside the organization that they're supporting. So there's been a shift of foundation money and of private money and of just charitable money towards these Native conservation organizations that are involving Native people, involving in conservation projects. It's to me, it's heartening to see this. It should be to anybody, and it certainly is to Native people, because they're able to move back onto their land now, where they were good stewards. They've always been good stewards, and they're able to demonstrate their stewardship to conservationists. I found that as I was working on this project, that the people at the headquarters of these organizations in Washington really didn't understand the problem. They didn't understand the conflict. Their jobs mostly were raising money to keep these huge organizations going. I mean, Conservation International, I think, now has offices in 80 different countries. They've got fleets of planes and boats and cars and huge staff of people that have to be supported. So the leadership are out raising money. It's the people I found that were working in the field who understood the conflict, understood the problem, and who I hope will rise to power and prominence in those organizations, and with them take what they've learned about the value that Native people have brought to land and to their homelands and to the very areas that are now protected areas. And I think that is happening. And I think that the foundation funders, particularly big foundations like Gordon Moore, who gave the largest single conservation grant in history, $500 million to Conservation International. I think now they're beginning to realize that you've got to involve Native people in this project, and they have to be equal partners. And Gordon Moore has told Conservation International that, and insisted that some of the money that Gordon Moore has been giving to them has to be passed through to small local conservation organizations driven by and involving Native people. So there are good things happening in the field, and the relationship is improving. There are now conservation organizations that are Native driven. There's one called Terra Nova. And there are others forming now that are Indigenous run and Indigenous operated conservation groups. I mean, there were two interesting things that happened to me, that I was accused of while I was working on this project. This was a 4-year project, and I spent probably a quarter to half my time on the road outside the United States. And there were two things that I was accused of. One was stealing stories. And very, very frequently, I would go and visit a Indigenous community somewhere, and the first thing I would hear was, oh God, another journalist, another historian, another anthropologist in here, getting our story and taking it back to the Western world and publishing it and making money. In other words, you're stealing and selling our stories. That was one thing. The other thing I was accused of a lot was, and this was more by conservationists, was romanticism, that I was overly romantic about indigenous cultures and indigenous societies and indigenous people. The point I would make to those people who were part of a movement, remember, is that there's never been a social movement in history that wasn't to some degree, whether it's a revolutionary movement or just a rights movement or anything, that wasn't some degree driven by romanticism. So I cop to it, right? And I think that any of you that are listening that are active in any of these movements that gets accused of being romantic, whether it's about wilderness or about indigenous people, cop to it. There's nothing wrong with being romantic about something. One last thing before I open it up to questions, and I really hope out there you have some questions, because I do better with Q&A than I do lecturing. I always have. And that's the question of race. I very deliberately did not use the word race or racism anywhere in this manuscript. And I didn't do it in the sort of screenwriter sense of show, don't tell. I didn't have to use the word. It's so bloody obvious. Not in excess of 99% of the people who have been forcibly evicted from their land in the interest of conservation have been people of color. And in excess of 99% of the people who have been granted inholdings in public land where it's been created around the world have been white people of European extraction. Now that just says it all, and it's just obvious. So you make those points, you don't have to use the R word, but it is unfortunately one of the many histories of racism in world history, but it's one where you don't have to use the word. So I don't, or I didn't in the book. I'm using it now, but I didn't in the book. That's about it. I'd be happy now to answer questions. And I don't think I've forgotten anything I wanted to tell you. There's Chuck. Any questions come in, Chuck?
Well, yeah, there's one that actually I have. I used to work for the National Park Service for years, and there was issues at Yosemite, and you had mentioned Yosemite as kind of one of the stories you had heard that kind of started you off on this track, and I was wondering if you would talk about that. But
Sure.
my experience with the Park Service was in more recent times, there was still very controversial there, issues with consultations and who to consult with. And there was even a secret investigation by the Park Service into that they never released, even internally. So this was like 5 to 10 years ago. So it was still going on.
Yeah. Yeah, Yosemite is actually the first chapter in this book. And it is because that's really where the whole model for conservation started. John Muir was a wilderness romantic himself, who had no use for Native people. He thought they were dirty diggers, was the word he used to describe them. And he believed that, and he discovered it hiking around the high Sierras of California, he discovered this beautiful, beautiful valley, which is, it's undeniably beautiful. Um, and his suggestion for this valley was get the Miwoks and the Paiutes and the Awanishi out of here and make it a national park for beleaguered white people to go and visit when they need a dose of nature. Um, and that that happened, of course. And it happened very violently because it happened at a time when the governor of California believed that all Native people should be completely eliminated from the state forcibly, right? And at arms. And there were battalions formed in California at the behest of the government. The Mariposa Battalion was the one that cleared out Yosemite, but there were battalions, armed battalions, that were instructed to eliminate Indians and other Native people from the state. And I never heard or saw any evidence of John Muir or any of the founders and people who created Yosemite fighting that policy. So Yosemite really was the model that spread to 7 other American national parks and then ultimately to the whole world. It is the model for what became known as fortress conservation, which is taking basically creating a protected area, putting a boundary around it, and keeping people out and keeping wildlife in, creating a fortress for conservation. And that Yosemite was the first fortress. You had another question, Chuck?
Yeah, the question has come in. Do the numbers you cite, Ray, number of people evicted from conservation land, include those displaced by federal acquisition of land in the US and Canada?
Yes, sure. Starting with Yosemite. Absolutely. Yeah, sure. And again, almost all of the people that were displaced in the U.S. and Canada by the park services and others were Native people, Indigenous people, and almost all of the people who were allowed to stay in as inholders were people of European extraction. So a little bit of racism there. Who's your guest there, Chuck?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Mark. This is Rosita Worrell.
Hi.
I'm president of the Sealaska Heritage Institute. And first of all, I've really thoroughly enjoyed your book. And also, your lecture has been great and enlightening. And I hope people read it. I hope people, understand what's happened to Indigenous people. And I mean, your book and your lecture actually spoke to what happened to us here in Southeast. We were once a very wealthy society, and unfortunately, our lands were taken to create the Tongass National Forest, the Glacier Bay National Park, and we have become paupers in our own land. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, are there any models or any government anywhere that has chosen to return at least access, if not ownership of the land, of these conservation lands? Has anyone ever allowed for Indigenous people to reclaim or to use, their former lands?
I think that is happening. I think it's happening to a degree in Botswana with the Bushmen, the Kalahari, and in other places, but it's very limited. And it's often attached to ecotourism. So, if people are willing to do fertility dances in front of tourists, they're often let back into their land if they agree to do that. So, the Masai Mara and some of the national parks in Africa, in that part of Africa, are employing and allowing people to go back in, the Maasai and others to go back in, but they're really more as tourist attractions and tourist workers than in people who are living the life that they lived before. Although the Maasai, there are some areas where the Maasai are still driving their cattle and allowing to live their traditional lives.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I saw the Sierra Club's apology to Indigenous people for their racism in the taking of conservation land, and also acknowledging that their revered leader was probably perhaps one of the racist individuals that were thought Native people's lands are best held in their land. And I'm talking about John Muir, because he's also very notorious up here in Alaska. And I'm wondering, and I wrote to the Sierra Club, and I received a letter back, and they said, oh yeah, well, we would take your letter under advisement or something. Have you heard of any action that they've initiated other than that apology?
No, but the Sierra Club's interesting. And as recently as the in 1920s, the Sierra Club posted a National Park Service policy, supported the policy that posted the national parks as whites only places. And the Sierra Club actually, the membership voted to support that. Sierra Club is interesting as environmental organizations go, because it's the only one that is really truly democratic. So, sorry. You there?
We're here.
No, my phone went off. Yeah, it's democratic, but they tend to vote really badly. I mean, they said they voted to support whites only in the national parks. They're very strong anti-immigration voting in the Sierra Club, and they're, as you say, I mean, the tradition. I mean, their tradition, the John Muir tradition. John Muir was a terrible old racist, and he owned a slave, so he was not one of my favorite people, and it's interesting what they've done with his archives. They've planted all the positive archives in one archive, and protected some of the stuff he wrote and said, which is I found in the Bancroft, which is not his archive. So he's a mixed blessing, John Muir. Then there's still conservationists still worship him, right? But he's definitely a mixed guy.
So we don't think Sierra Club has done anything other than the apology.
I don't think so. I mean, in fact, I don't think they're really in much of a position to do anything. They're not operating in parts of the world where this has been going on, where displacement, forced evacuations have been going on since the creation of the national parks in the United States, which is a done deal. But so I don't think they're doing anything now, but they may be. I may be wrong about that. I'm not following it that closely. It's a book I finished in 2009.
A hollow apology.
So we do have another question or comment that came in. It reads, as you mentioned Maasai, I think in particular the stark difference between Tanzania and Kenya along the Kajiado border, and how practices of agro-pastoralism change along colonial-induced ethnic strife.
That's a remark, not a question, right?
That's a remark. I guess, yeah, do you have a comment on that? Or?
Well, it's interesting. The Maasai, of course, the entire Rift Valley, all the way from, Ethiopia all the way down to Tanzania, that was their stomping ground. They're a cattle culture, and they drove their cattle up and down the Rift Valley, and of course lost more and more and more of their land. And I started asking, where did they go? Where did all these young Maasai go when they get run off their land? And he said, have you ever been to Dar es Salaam? And which is, the capital of Tanzania. And I hadn't. So I went down to Dar es Salaam. And sure enough, Dar es Salaam is a port town. It's a pretty rough town. And, lots of bars, lots of brothels. A lot of the people who were bodyguarding and bouncing at the bars and brothels in Dar es Salaam are young Maasai men. So I thought that was to me, that was doubly tragic. They get pushed out of this culture that they've been part of for, thousands of years, healthy culture, raising cattle, and they become bouncers in bars in a port town. and it's very much like the impoverishment of your people in Alaska. I mean, the people who have been allowed back into some kind of adjacency to their former land um, are not getting rich. I mean, they're still at the low end of the money economy, um, and which is doubly tragic because they didn't need money in their own systems, in their older systems, in their traditional systems. So now they're in the money economy, but they're in the low end of it. So they're living on peanut wages, right? It's sad. Oh.
So you mentioned this, the implications of this romanticism in the environment, in the conservation movement, and that contrast between the noble savage and what others say of the real story. I may have known that there was an interesting debate 20 years ago or so in anthropology on that same topic, and a book came out called The Ecological Indian, and it was full of reflections that was really a false concept, and that was answered with another book by other anthropologists who wrote essays and actually did deeper ethnography to show that the belief systems and the cultural practices and all actually did revolve around this concept of reciprocity and relationship with non-human beings in the environment. So that contrast is comes up in different arenas.
Well, I mean, I am not a total romantic. I know that there are Native people and indigenous communities around the world that are not, are misbehaving ecologically, but it's usually because they have formed some kind of an alliance or an allegiance with a logging company or a mining company, or somebody who's been plying them with drugs and liquor, and you can't get too romantic about what's become of those cultures, but it really isn't their fault that they are selling their trees, or allowing petroleros to come in and drill their land in return for some very small favors. So yeah, I try not to be too romantic about it, and when people accuse me of being romantic about it, I say, yeah, I am. But what's wrong with romance?
Well, I'm an anthropologist by training.
Oh, really?
Yes, I'm an anthropologist by training, and I often say to tell my students and my Indigenous students, that we can't romanticize our culture, that we do have to all, speak the truth. And we had slaves, we don't value slaves today, but in the past we did. But we also, in our land claim settlement, we only received 2%, less than 2% of our Aboriginal land base. And so we went into timber development, and it was something new to us. And what we ended up doing was hiring scientists and good people that would help us. And, I always say, and I was on the board, I was on the Sealaska Corporation board, and I say, yes, we made mistakes, but we took an assessment and really looked at what we were doing. And at this point in time, we brought back to the forefront our core cultural values. And we tried to figure out how can we develop and meet our core cultural values of honoring the land and utilizing the land. And so we realized that we really had to bring science in, to help us out. And we hired scientists. We started doing, full assessment about tree growth, impacts of tree harvest on the animals. And over time, we developed what we thought would be a sustainable model for sustainable harvest. And additionally, we said we need to figure out how do we monetize our trees without harvesting them, because under the Land Claims Act, it said that we did have some responsibility to promote the social and economic welfare of our people.
Yeah.
And so we actually even went back to Congress, exchanged some old growth for second growth so that we could move towards the sustainability. And that's, so that is our long-term goal. But it was a learning lesson for us, how to, I mean, the importance of bringing science along with our traditional religious practices that we had.
Mhm.
And we had religious spiritual practices of how do we care for the land. And
Well,
yeah,
as I said, the melding of those two traditions will make you stronger, strong like two people, as that man said. You know, the story you're telling me is basically the story of Haida Gwaii, which was my next book.
oh, great.
Um,
Oh, great.
you know, and
Uh-huh.
I mean they're still logging, but they're logging scientifically, they're logging sustainably, and they are the loggers. They're not letting Weyerhaeuser or any big companies come in and log. They're logging the land, and you know, they're planting, replacing, they're doing everything that sustainable yield logging should be doing. Um, and they're very modern. They are very scientific. I mean, they're constantly sending their children to University of British Columbia to become lawyers and agronomists and scientists of one sort or another. And I think Haida Gwaii is going to become an amazing place in a very few years.
Well, I hope you're going to come back and give us a lecture on that.
I will.
Great. Yeah.
We have another comment. I guess it's a question, this one. Do you see involvement of more Native people in resource management through structures like the U.S. Forest Service as a stepping stone towards justice, or does that further legitimize tools of destruction?
No, I don't think it legitimizes tools of destruction. Um, I live right across the street from where I live is a national park, the Point Reyes National Seashore, and it was Miwok land. The park still honors that, and there is a Miwok visitors community there, and there are Miwoks working for the Park Service and Pomos. No, I don't have a problem with Native people going to work for the National Park Service or any of these organizations that were part of the problem a mere 25 or 30 years ago, because they bring this knowledge that you're talking about with them, and the sensibilities and the values and the traditional ecological knowledge, which is so important for ecologists to understand. Um, so yeah, no, I don't. My answer to my question is I don't have a problem with it at all.
Hmm.
Any more questions?
Well, um, actually, well, since you mentioned we're talking about the Park Service, they do have a program called compacting, which they applies to them, applies to interior agencies, that promotes relationships with Indian tribes to take over functions of national parks um, in through contracting.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, there is that recognition. A number of parks have pretty extensive relationships with neighboring tribes over various functions that are needed to be carried out in the parks, to maintain the parks and to provide visitor services and that sort of thing. So
They also have the Park Service, and many of the big national parks also have historians, and it's interesting how they regard this history. Um, they uh, they don't completely agree with me about the history of national parks vis-a-vis um, the eviction of Native people that was required to create Yellowstone, Zion, and of course Yosemite, and 7 of the national parks, all involved, could not have been created had they not evicted Native people. And there was the interesting thing about was the lies that they told about Native people as an excuse for evicting them. Um, and the historians now are sort of sitting back in their offices, a bit embarrassed about the Park Service's own history about evicting Native people to create the parks. But you know, if you take them out of the Park Service and buy them a beer, they know what happened. and they'll admit it.
Yeah, yeah. There was also an applied anthropology program in the Park Service, and
Yeah.
of which I was a part of. And there was a story I heard about Yellowstone where they hired Nabokov, I forget his first name, grandson of the author, but
Yeah.
he came up and did what was called an overview and assessment and reported that for Yellowstone and the number of tribes and the people and all. And he titled his report "Presence Denied." Presented it to the park, and blah blah blah. And the park, I don't know. One of the managers said, "Well, you can't title that book that. We have to call it. You have to call it something else." So he thought about it for a minute and said, "How about Presence Restored?" Said, "No, you can't call it that either." So he said, "All right, forget it." And then he went out and published it himself. So that report's available as a publication.
I'll look for it.
A book, yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much. This has been a great talk and very helpful in talking about this concept and bringing it out. And so really appreciate your work on this pioneering work to bring it all together in a world context, and bringing out this history. So thank you.
Well, if I'm going to close with anything, it's just that I'm optimistic about the future of this conflict and the future of this relationship. I think that big conservation is getting religion about this. They're realizing that they made some terrible mistakes in the 20th century, and they're finding ways to undo them. They're hiring, actually, all of the bingos now have staffs of anthropologists who've been living with and studying Native people and are bringing that information being into those organizations. So things are improving. Things are improving.
So we have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you'll take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. Thank you all again.